I know a good number of you, but I don't know everyone here. So I just want to do a little interaction. I'm the last person of the day. Everybody's tired. Half of you have left. How many people here, and I know there's a couple at the back, so there probably are more. How many people here are brand new to this idea of tree farming? Brand spanking new. Everybody at the back is brand spanking new. They were afraid of you guys at the front. They mostly don't bite, and sometimes they have really good information. So just, chat them up. Okay, I'm going to start. Oh, and then I have one more question. Does anybody here have a Harvard degree? I'm going to tell you a story, and you can decide. So I deal in the world of carbon. I've been dealing in the world of carbon for more than a decade with the work that I was at the University of Washington, and have since become a consultant for this consortium. CORUM stands for the Consortium for Research on Renewable Industrial Materials, aka wood. Really looking at what is the environmental footprint of producing wood, and then along comes this whole idea of climate change. And what does producing wood, how does that intersect with this idea of climate change? And so you can find anything on YouTube. I was talking recently with a colleague of mine, and she talked about this survey they did of graduating Harvard students. So they had just got their graduation, and they interviewed them sort of as an exit interview. And they had a little tiny seedling in one hand and a block of wood in the other. And they said, okay, how does obviously the seedling weighs, 10 ounces, and this block of wood weighs 10 pounds. How did the weight get in there? And so Kevin talked about it, and most of you tree farmers will know that. But how did the weight get in there? And what does photosynthesis comprise of? You sound like the Harvard grad. I think you. But that was the point. Even though we all sort of intuitively know this, we can't really explain the equation because we forgot grade 8 biology. We like sugar. So we want to burn this into your brain. There it is. That's the equation. And it's amazing how many people, when you talk to them about wood storing carbon, they can't really imagine it, and they don't know where the carbon comes from. They think it comes from the ground. Well, it doesn't. It comes from the air. That's where all the carbon comes from. And then, of course, you add a little bit of water, sunshine, that's magic, and voila, you get wood, which is basically trees and every other kind of vegetation is basically a sugar factory. And then you arrange it in this, magnificent thing we call a tree, which then turns into a forest, and you get some nice byproducts, water and oxygen. And it was amazing how many people could not really explain how this block of wood could come from this little tiny tree. It was like, it was water, and it was nutrients, and it was everything from the soil. But they really did have a disconnect of how that came from the air. Which is why when you hear some of these conversations that are happening out there with the general public, they're like, well, you cut down the trees and it all goes back into the air magically. What about the wood? That's where the carbon is. 401 carbon to nitrogen. So I just wanted to remind everybody to remember this really simple, I think it was probably 8th grade equation. And you don't have to be shy about not remembering. I had to look it up to put it on the slide. But this idea that really there is a profound chemical reaction that happens in all of our forests, and if we wanted to invent something called carbon capture and storage, and I'll tell you in my world there's lots of people spending a lot of money trying to figure out how to do carbon capture and storage as an engineered solution. And my solution is grow more trees, because that is one of the most efficient ways to do it, and it really ends up being an engineered solution. But then you get this question about, well, what about wood? What about this? This is a nice little booklet that was made by, I think, the Canadian Wood Council or something. Tackle climate change, use wood. What happens with the forests? You know, what's all the buzz about this? Or the other one that we're really hearing a lot about, tall wood buildings. What's all the buzz about this? And I took this off the Think Wood site. Which one of these is the pointer? The red one? This all came from the Think Wood site about all of these parts of the country that are jumping on this bandwagon of let's just build with wood. It's environmentally friendly. And there's some really interesting examples of it. There's lots of reasons why it's a good thing to build with. This is actually on the University of British Columbia campus. It doesn't look like that now. It looks like a regular dormitory. It has some little bits of nice wood inside, but it's completely of wood. So this has become part of this conversation and part of the attempt to understand how to address climate change using forests, because there is international interest in doing this. There's, I think, national interest in doing it, but always it comes back to, but what about the forests? If you build with all this wood, if there's suddenly this huge demand for wood, does that mean we cut down all the forests? What is required to make sure that this equation is balanced? And so I'm doing some work with folks in the manufacturing area and also in the built environment, architects, engineers, builders, developers, talking about something that we're calling the circular carbon economy. Growing the circular carbon economy. This is the new buzz. And it starts with, obviously, a forest. And each one of these, you can think of each one of these as a circle of from creation to use. And then typically you'll have a disposal cycle in there. So if you're doing something like steel, for example, you're going to dig that stuff out of the ground, you're going to refine it, you're going to put it into use, and then you're going to recycle it and you do it again. So it's just one cycle. With forests, it's a lot more complicated, because when you're done using the wood, it doesn't go back to the forest. It goes to the atmosphere and then back to the forest. And so when you look at this circular idea, the complication comes from the fact that you might be looking at 300 or 400 years in that cycle. You know, if you're in the southeast, it takes about 25 years to grow a tree to merchantable size. Here we might get away with 35, 40, 50. If you're in northern BC, it's like closer to 80. And if you're in northern Quebec, it's closer to 100. So it takes 100 years to do this, less than a year to do this, and then how long can you put that wood in the building to store that carbon? And really to think about this whole cycle as tree farmers, you're growing it, so you have a set amount of acres. Let's say you have 100 acres. So that 100 acres can produce a certain amount of wood, and then, you know, it's going to reach a saturation point. If you harvest that 100 acres and you put it in a building and it lasts for 200 or 300 years, you can probably grow at least another 2 crops if you're in northern Quebec, or another 5 or 6 if you're here in the Pacific Northwest. So this whole story becomes part of the critical story of understanding how forests and carbon are part of the solution to climate change. I have a limited amount of time here, so I'm going to keep plowing through this. But if there are questions, if you're looking at that and saying that doesn't make any sense, just do that. I'm fairly responsive. But when we think about this whole system, the only thing you can affect yourself personally is this piece here. And the only thing you can affect sort of in the near term is this piece here, which is what I call the forest sector. I don't separate what the tree farmer is doing from what the milling infrastructure is doing, because when you do that, you're going to find out that you really have to consider them together in order to understand the implications of your system, what you need to do as a system in order to, maintain this flow over this very long period of time. So the way that I think about it is as tree farmers, we store carbon, we sequester carbon in these very beautiful forests, and then as the builders, they store carbon in these very beautiful buildings, and if you're really lucky, you get to live in one, or work in one, or recreate in one. And down here is just the people who took the pictures. Now, when you harvest wood, obviously, you emit carbon. You have to grow it. You have to do your site prep. You have to do any kind of thinning. You have to harvest it. You have to take it to the mill. You have to process it. That emits carbon, or greenhouse gases. It emits a lot of things. So what we've done over the last 20-some years is produce what we're now calling the nutrition label for wood. That nutrition label is called an environmental product declaration, but it's really a nutrition label. Instead of telling the amount of carbs and the amount of fat and the amount of protein, it's telling you what the emissions were in terms of global warming potential, which is really a measure of the equivalent carbon dioxide emissions from that wood, or from producing that wood. In this case, I think it was a cubic meter of wood. If you're publishing right now, you have to publish in metric. And, I'm a real big advocate for the U.S. to go to metric. It makes life so much easier. And then some other things that you want to measure. How much, what do you have in terms of acidification, eutrophication? There's a number of things that you're required to report based on national and international standards. So this is the nutrition label for the Pacific Northwest Douglas fir zone, something that myself and a colleague, Maureen Pootman, I think we published that in 2017, might have been 2018. So you have this emission, and then what you also have is what we call carbon balance. We know that the wood stores carbon. It's about 50% carbon by dry weight. Varies by species. 50% is a good rule of thumb. So when that tree is completely dry, it's about 50% carbon. The carbon dioxide converted to carbon. You have to do some calculations in here. There is math associated with science. We know based on the density of the wood, we can calculate what the carbon dioxide uptake is in that cubic meter of wood, and we know what it took to produce it. So we're going to get a net, and it's always negative. And it's always negative because the carbon dioxide was sucked out of the atmosphere. That's your negative, and then you have all these emissions that move you towards positive. But this is why you can say that wood is a carbon negative technology. It's storing more carbon than it takes to produce it. And that's from the seedling, actually putting the seed and growing the seedling, putting it in the ground, growing it for that, in this case we use a 45-year rotation, harvesting it, putting it on the truck, taking it to the mill, going through all that process. You've even wrapped the lumber, and it's ready to go to the big box store. And you still are way in negative territory. This is where the excitement is around building with tall wood, because you're storing carbon in the building, not just in the forest. But the real basis of that story is keeping forests as forests. And the question you have to ask as tree farmers, or wannabe tree farmers, is, what's my role? What do I need to do to make this work to address climate change? Because, if you just listen to everything we just heard, you can go home a little bit depressed and want to have your by 10 o'clock this morning, I'm like, maybe you just need that afternoon glass of wine already. But what is your role? And I think you have a pretty significant role. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, talking about this and be involved in the way that I am involved, because I think we're actually the people in this room and people like you have one of the most critical roles, whether you realize it or not. I put this up. This is somewhat modified. I gave a similar talk to Oregon Small Woodland Owners Association back in January. But they gave me about 3 hours, and I just worked them. I only have an hour here. But I wanted to address there. I did not know, most of my audience, and I wanted to address some various opinions in the room. One of them is, well, there's nothing you can do. When the sky, if you're truly believing the sky is falling and there's nothing you can do, probably not in this crowd, because everyone here is a lifelong learner looking for solutions. There's some things you can do that are pretty helpful. There's some things you can do, I think, that are pretty significant. And then there's, geez, you just don't know. Well, I'm hoping by the end of the day, we can just cross that baby out. Even if you don't know all the specifics, you're going to have some ideas of where to look and how to think about it, and maybe who to talk to in this room. I want to talk a little bit about the nothing camp and the reasons for that kind of depression. I think the first one is everything we heard about climate change. As I went through the day, I'm like, oh, they already talked about that. Oh, they already talked about that. But this one's a little bit different because first thing this morning, Jessica talked basically about 1850 to now, and she had that trend line. If you go back about 1,000 years, we really are in new territory here in terms of carbon dioxide. And that is, it means that we're moving into these novel areas, which means we're going to have to use all of our ingenuity to figure out how to go forward. Again, you have these bark beetle maps. I like to show this one. This was actually part of some work I did for my PhD. This is BC, about 17 million hectares, so 35 million acres, dead trees. And it started taking off in 99. I have to say that they were very clear this is hotter or warmer winters. Very clear. We don't have that situation in this is Washington State. It took off about the same time. It was hotter summers. Almost exclusively, those stinking hot days in summer were what was allowing this to emerge. So we do have these trends. Now the wildfire thing, and I want to talk a little bit about this, not because everybody else didn't talk about wildfire, but because when we look at this stuff as a scientist, you're using a model, you're using data, and you're creating a model to try to understand impacts. And Brad alluded to this a little bit, but he really didn't go into detail. And I think the point to make here is in 2004, I was working with some colleagues. This guy ended up on my grad committee. And he had published a paper saying, looking at all of those models, that by 2050, we were going to have a doubling of fire extent by 2050. The thing that grabs me is, starting in 2000, when we had all that bark beetle outbreak, all those other things, we already have a doubling. Statistically, we have already doubled, and we're 30 years ahead of that projection from 2004. Now, Brad alluded to that when he talked about when they did those scenarios, that we were already in that. And so that suggests that even now when we're thinking about what to harvest or what to plant and how to plant, and thinking about some of that microsite selection, all of those sorts of things, to recognize we're probably dealing with that now. Much more on the east side than the west side. But it does emerge from year to year. And then, of course, there's always these gory pictures about running through a fire. And it really is about extreme events. And I wanted to highlight this. Originally, I'm from Alberta. This particular fire was the Fort McMurray fire. You know, we thought we were bad. We burned, I don't know, a little over 1 million acres in 2015 in Washington State. They burned over 1 million acres in a couple of weeks, starting in May of whatever year that was. I can't remember what year it was, 2016. 1 million acres in May. They had 85-degree temperature, relative humidity of 12%. I'll tell you, growing up there, it barely gets above freezing in May. And the leaves weren't even out. It was running through dry grass and very, very dry desiccated trees to engulf this town. They lost about 2,500 houses, but no people. So that was pretty remarkable. And so when we think about these extreme, we're never going to be able to prepare for extreme events in any great way, but we certainly can be aware of them in terms of living out in rural areas and how to build that resilience within our communities so we can get away. Again, talking about doing nothing, some people want to throw up their hands and say, well, we have all of these issues, we just don't want to add a management impact to some of our sensitive sites. And big arguments about that in the riparian zones. This is a really juicy looking riparian zone until it burns, and this is the other side of the hill where it burned. It's not so juicy now. And so this whole conversation that we had earlier about ponds and riparian zones and other sensitive sites, I think we need to really think about that as a community and think about that as a society as how do we mitigate those risks? Because doing nothing often has some pretty significant impacts. And we can see that. Here's an example, a lot of inventory data here starting in 1953, that's what I thought it was, 1953 through 2016. So every 10 years the federal government will put out a report talking about the state of the forest. And this is annual growth, mortality, and harvest on national forest timberlands in the U.S. What's kind of obvious, you see that trend line, right? This is the amount of mortality. And that's your trend line. Every 10 years, you're seeing the mortality. And then this is the net growth. So gross growth, total growth is you add the red plus the green. So you get it up here. And then you subtract that 70% that's dying. Again, there's a lot of reasons for that. But when we're thinking about doing nothing, this is one of the reasons to get off our butt and do something. The other reason that often comes up for people to say, well, I'm not going to do too much investment in this little piece of property, I'm going to develop. Or if I don't develop, my heirs are going to develop. They're not that interested in growing trees. And there's lots of information out there that suggests that we're seeing more and more of that, particularly here in Washington State. 2006, they said, well, we're losing about 1% of our forest land per year. 2016 RPA data says we're losing about 1.1% of our forest land per year. And it's almost all in the what we call non-corporate category, which means the smaller landowners are converting at a rate of about 1.1% per year. That's where we're losing our forest land. We're losing it from people like, I'm not going to say people like you, you're here. I'm going to say people that don't really understand some of the contributions they could make towards some of the issues that they think are really pressing. And fundamentally, the value of selling is so much greater than the value you can make growing trees. I'm going to use an example. So here's Washington State. Here's Puget Sound. We know that there's 1,500 people. I think it's 1,500 people a week moving into the Seattle area. I know, when I heard that, I was like, really? You sure it wasn't a month or a year? No, a week. And I don't know if you saw the news maybe a month ago, the fastest growing city with the highest demand for housing in North America is now Tacoma, because they can't afford to live in Seattle. So they moved to Tacoma. And we're doing some work in the Puyallup River watershed. It flows down into, right there through Tacoma. and that's the watershed highlighted here. The park's at the top, so this is Mount Rainier, and this is the Sound. And then when you zoom in, this is the most interesting thing to me, is we've separated out. So right next to the city, you can expect development. Here's what we call the mid-watershed. It's mostly populated by small forest landowners and little tiny communities. And then what they call the upper watershed is here, so that's your sort of large industrial owners. And then you have Mount Rainier, the national park. When you talk to planners, they fully anticipate all of this forest will be gone in 20 to 30 years. It's going to be developed. So your ability to sequester any carbon on those trees is going to go with it. And this is something that is going to have a pretty significant effect in terms of our ability to do a lot of things. One of them is to maintain markets so the rest of the people that want to grow trees have a way to grow them. I found this to be really compelling for me, is that whether we're talking about Douglas fir, having a market for Douglas fir here, or having a market for some of the hardwoods in Asia, where they're now mowing down their forests and planting palm oil, without the market, there's no reason to keep growing the trees. There is such a strong correlation between keeping forests as forests, sustaining forests, and having markets, which is why I'm now on the bandwagon of talking about it as a forest sector, because without the market, the incentive to keep trees goes away. And it goes away because if it's not you that's going to develop, it's going to be your heirs, because they can't afford to keep it. Or they can't afford to keep it relative to the value of something else. This is really an interesting one. So this is the trend in deforestation. So that's permanent, not harvest, but harvest and conversion to some other use. This is the trends starting in the 1700s. Obviously, there was a lot of deforestation as we moved into the temperate zones, like in North America, where we built our cities and our farms and everything else. And it's basically gone to almost zero. You're seeing the deforestation in the tropics, where they're converting it to other uses now. Now, ideally, this will also be declining as they move to a place where they can start to develop markets and sustain markets, because we kind of do need all the force we can get to address some of these emergent climate issues. One of the other reasons I hear from people about not thinking about this and not thinking about doing anything about climate change is, well, you know, I can change my light bulbs, but what else can I do? They really see themselves as a little cog in a big wheel. And I use this as an example of, if you're harvesting once in your lifetime, you're kind of like this. You're not having that huge impact. If you're harvesting every 3 to 5 years, and I know there's some people in here that are doing that, you're more keeping sort of, I'm going to call it a stable amount of carbon stored on the landscape, and the rest is going into your mills and your products. But you really need to be a big player to basically have a relatively stable inventory, and therefore you could say, well, in terms of impact, my operation is carbon neutral. I'm going to turn that on its head and say, individually you might be like this, but collectively, if there's 215,000 small forest landowners in Washington State, and maybe about 175,000 of them might have over 20 acres. Collectively, we can very much be here if we can address a bunch of these questions and ideas and concerns we have about managing for carbon and harvesting it and putting it in wood products. Because so much of our culture is around don't touch it. It's off limits, because maybe it's because it's my piece of paradise, but maybe it's because we think that somehow that's wrong, that we're somehow guilty for it. And I'm going to use an example from Kent a couple of years ago. We were at a workshop, and they were talking about this carbon-friendly forestry, and he stood up and he talked about feeling guilty cutting his trees, and everybody cheered, you know, and sort of laughed, and it was like, ooh, like as if you should be guilty. Missing the point that if you don't cut them, you don't have wood products. You're going to get them from Siberia with quarter the growth rate. And if you don't cut them, you don't have an incentive to keep those forests as forests. And I think that's a message that everybody can carry to all of the people that they interact with, to get them to understand the importance of the work that you do as a tree farmer. And it's not just about growing it, it's also about cutting it. So what can you do about carbon mitigation as something helpful? I'm going to talk about the something helpful camp. And I have 3 different bullets here that I want to talk a little bit about each of them. And the reason I do that is that I recognize that everybody has different objectives. Some people want to have, sort of this old growth thing and peck away at various trees, and they're going to have an impact. They're still going to be able to keep their forest as forest, but they're not going to be providing as much wood, that carbon negative technology to society, but they're still maintaining their forest, managing differently and managing more intensively. So let's talk about growing trees longer. This is data, and what I've done here is I've substituted space for time, and you're like, what does that mean? That means that I don't have a growth, sort of, this is time here, this is decades, 300 years, and then this is your carbon in your standing inventory, right? I don't have inventory where I've planted a seedling and watched what happened over 300 years. Nobody does. So what we do is we take different age classes of tree and we say what's the standing carbon in that age class, and then you map that. And so you see these little bloopers here, but essentially if you average that out, it's kind of that flat line. This is what we can expect in Western Washington as sort of an average maximum carbon stored in the forest in the live tree component. About 175 metric tons per hectare. Okay.
I think it says that in there, but I'm thinking in terms of what I have heard people talking about. What's the point at which a Doug fir west side peaks out in growing capacity? And I remember 75 years or something like that. And then the other question is, well, what's the maximum economic rate of return age for Doug fir in the west side? And I'm hearing industry folks talk in terms of 35 or 40 or 45 years. So does this slide say if you're managing for carbon, it's about 75 years? Is that the way to interpret that?
No.
Okay.
But we're going to get to this. You can ask that question about 4 more slides.
Sorry.
No. I think it's good because there is a big argument about, well, shouldn't we just grow them longer? Maybe. And we're going to talk about that. It depends on your site. It depends on a lot of different things, but that is true. Your Douglas fir really starts kicking it up at about 35 and can go to 90 at this really high rate of accumulation. Grows really, really fast in that window, depending on your site. And as we heard today, depending on some of these risk factors that 20 years ago we didn't have to think about, and now we do. I was sitting back there as they were describing these predicted changes and some of the stuff with seed provenance that Brad was talking about. I'm like, maybe I should plan for a 40-year rotation. Because by then, we'll have a better idea of what might grow, right? What might be more suited further on. Although I'd say a lot of the issues with this, is it suited or isn't it suited, really matters in probably that first 10 to 15 years because you're going to have a really hard time getting establishment. And then you're going to have a really hard time in that sort of, when those trees are most vulnerable, keeping them alive. That's the trick. Right? So that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it, but I bet you there's 50 different opinions on how people would approach it in their particular situation. The reason I use this example is because this is based on all the stands in the inventory. So it's an average. This is your average Joe. This is your average Joe tree farm. And I'll tell you some other cool things. If you want to grow trees longer and you have a really good site, you might not be able to sell them for very much money. I don't know if many of you guys know this guy, but some of you will know him. That's Mike Warjohn. If you don't know him, he's built like a linebacker. He's 6'5". That's one of his 60-year-old trees. It's enormous. It's so big that he can only sell it to one mill in Southern Oregon or ship it to China. So if you have really good growing sites, you may not want to grow your trees that long because you won't have a market for them. And in his case, he says, oh, that one has a lot of knots, so it goes to China. I get, less money than if I had a really high-grade saw log going here to some mill. Well, that's useful to know. If you have really good ground. I wish I had a tree like that. Anyway. But I want to talk more about what I call the tiger woods of the forest. There is research that says, well, actually, you can reach up to 450 tons of carbon per hectare on west side forests, and that should be your target. That's like me going and playing golf with Tiger Woods. Not a hope. Very few of our stands are going to reach that number. We're probably down here at about, I'm going to use metrics because all of that was published in metrics. So this is about 500 cubic meters per hectare, which is between 30 and 40,000 board feet per acre right here. And then you have some ranges. These are some ranges from old growth in British Columbia and Vancouver Island. And it turns out that if you look at only the fully stocked stands, it's a little better than that. If you look at them all, it's a little less than that, which is kind of consistent with what you expect. As trees get older, damage happens, trees fall down. That's what old growth is. It's that opening up of the canopy and that complexity that develops. And sometimes you're going to find a Tiger Woods. But it's mostly not attainable. There's Tiger Woods. That one's actually on the H.G. Andrews research forest in Central Oregon. Beautiful site. Trees are incredible. They're about, 200 feet tall. They're incredible. But there's not very many places that we're going to get that. So doing nothing sometimes on a site like this kind of makes sense, but on lots of sites it doesn't. And then the other risk, again, going back to this, is we don't know where we're going in terms of novel climates and the kinds of extreme events that we're going to be facing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but just kind of have a backup plan. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about managing differently. And I want to use this as an example of, it doesn't matter, in many ways it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you manage. And I'm going to show you some examples of that based on some combination of some work or recommendations from Brian Laux, who many of you know. He's a local tree farmer here, a retired warehouser. Been looking at forests and growing trees for 40-some years. He knows a thing or two. But I'm going to take his stuff and put the carbon numbers to it so you can understand that any kind of management is better than no management. And so here's the example. So if you decided that you were going to do some pretty aggressive management and site prep and planting and get your stand well established and you let it grow and you decide you're not going to harvest it, you suddenly won the lottery and you didn't need it and you just wanted to grow big trees, you're going to get this. If you don't do anything, you're going to get maybe something like this. And if you happen to get a situation like when we purchased, you're going to get something like this, which had been logged, not reforested, came back with patchy, sort of crappy alder, and it will never really attain much of anything. So any kind of management is better than no management in terms of this idea of sequestering carbon, using the land to maximize the ability for those trees to take carbon out of the atmosphere if that's your goal. Can't remember why I put that in there, but oh, I know why. So I talk about this particular nutrition label was based on a publication, and that was based on some pretty aggressive management by using the industrial model here in the Pacific Northwest, based on inventory data and sampling of large landowners. And that was based on a 45-year rotation with this yield, again, 25 to 40,000 board feet. This little thing was, you plant the trees, you do all sorts of management, you take it up to 45 years, you cut it, you do it again, you do it again. That's that idea. So now I want to get into Brian Louse's ideas. So he's decided he's going to write down all of his information that he has garnered over his years as a forester before he's done, before he's out of here, before he's gone on to fresh fields and pastures new. And so he wrote a bunch of these drafts, and I looked at it and said, this is really interesting stuff for tree farmers. So here is his prescription for minimal management. This is a plant and do nothing. This is not a do nothing, which is the example I talked about. This is a plant and do nothing. And so he's recommending a pretty low planting density, 13 by 13. And, you know, this is my perfect tree planting grid, but you get the idea. 258 trees per acre. And his thought with this is, if that's all the energy you wanted to put into your tree planting, you know, in the olden days, you would get something. You'd get, you know, some coverage in the center. You get some fairly big trees by 40 that branches might be this big around. And because the branches are pretty big around, you don't have very good quality. A lot of it, he said, might go to pulp because it just doesn't make a 2x4. And that you would get a deduct. You wouldn't make as much money, but you didn't have to do much either. You could walk away. Now this assumes all 258 of them mostly live. Reality is, in the recent past, when we have these stinker of a drought years, they mostly don't live. And we're going to get to that in a second when I'll tell you some more of his history. So this is his minimal management for tree farmers. This is a recommendation. He says that we pretty much work here in the Lewis County area, which is where he spent most of his career. His second one said, well, a little bit more work per acre. You're going to do some spraying, so you're getting rid of that grass, you're getting rid of that competition. You're planting about 436 trees per acre on a 10 by 10 spacing. And then at some point, probably 20, you might do a pre-commercial. I think on this one he said he was going to do a pre-commercial down to about 300 trees per acre at about year 15. And then at about year 40 or 35 or 40, he's going to go into a commercial thin, bring it down again. And so he's going to be able to take a lot of that wood out of there and pick his best trees. This allows him to pick his best trees. But you're not super intensively managing. And then I want to talk a little bit about more intensively, and this is his more intensive management, and I think this is what he does. And talking earlier, it sounds like it's kind of a Doug Stinson goal. Planting a lot more trees, 9 by 9 spacing, 538 trees per acre. And the minimum required replant is 192. Is that the number? I see a nod from 190. Okay. So this is planting a lot more trees than is required by law. It requires a lot more management, but you're going to come out of that with some pretty impressive logs. He figures you can get, you know, a whole large number of big skookum 18-inch diameter logs at about year 40. At least down here in the valley, I think that must be on a pretty good site. Have 2 thinnings in there. And the point being that this will generate you a lot more money at the end of the day. So it's a lot more valuable to your heirs to keep that as forest like that. And once they get that big giant check, they might be inspired to do it again themselves 15 or 20 or 25 years from now when it's time for them to harvest. And so what I did was I took these parameters, these planting and prescriptions that he provided as recommendations for minimal, moderately intensive, and intensive management for small forest landowners, and I ran it through a computer program that I used to be able to simulate what would your volume be coming out and what would your carbon storage be coming out, using these three alternatives. Because I couldn't get a volume estimate out of them. And the reason I couldn't get a volume estimate out of them was very revealing. 10 years ago, I mean, we have done a lot of work in the last 70 years to really improve seedling quality. The growers know what they're doing. They do a really good job. You go out there and you have tree planters who know what they're doing and people who watch over them that know what they're doing. And it's not unusual to get 95, 98% survival. That's pretty good. What he's telling me is, well, you know, my latest stand, I planted my 538. The next year, half of them were dead. That one was late frost in November, had actually killed the trees, then they lifted and planted and they were still green, but they were dead. Right? So half of them were dead. So then he replants it, he still plants again, but that was the stinking hot year, and half of them are dead again. So this is going to be a struggle, but maybe one of the good things about doing it like this is if you get half of them to live, and you don't have any more resources or any more time, you might still end up with something 25, 30, 40 years from now. And so that's why he said, I don't know what the volume's going to be because I don't know if I can get these suckers to live. Right? But the good thing about a growth simulator, when you're doing this in science, is that all the trees are perfect and they all live. So, you know, at the end of the day, I was feeling, oh yeah, I got some numbers here. How realistic they are is another point. So this is the numbers. So there was the low intensity with the 238, the 436, and the 538. And this was, I put it on a 45-year rotation just because of the way the program works. It was easier for me to do that than mess around with 40, etc. But the relative numbers are interesting. So this is the carbon in metric tons per acre that's on the forest, taken off in products. Remember, when you're harvesting some of that and you're putting some in long-lived products, and it also includes the fact that some of that stuff, you take a round thing, you make a square thing, you have leftovers. And some of those leftovers go to the pulp mill to make paper, and some get burned as hog fuel, and some go to MDF and particle board. That's all calculated in there, and sort of those offsets. So you're looking to say, in a perfect world, those are not that different in terms of the carbon consequences. And in this, apparently the board foot per acre in that final entry, the low intensity was a little bit better than the moderate intensity, but not substantially different. Like I said, the model doesn't kill hardly enough trees, and it doesn't talk about quality. So this is why I say any kind of management is better than no management. Because the comparison, so I ran a thing where I had natural regeneration and I actually put some alder in there. My target on that one was trying to get, what was the number? I think it was 16,000 board feet per acre at about 15 years. That was my goal based on some averaging that I had found in the literature. And that's same period, about 10% of the tons of carbon stored. This is the do nothing, really do nothing. This is pretty minimal. This is moderate. This is high. It depends on how much time you want to spend out there playing in the woods. But it really does tell you that management matters a lot. Okay, where are we now? And here's an example of it really mattering. So now this is the southeast. We're not here, by the way. This is 1940s to 2010, and this is the yield, annualized dry yield. So it's per year. And then they've done the work to figure out how much of it was to do with planting and how much of it was to do with site prep and all the improvements that you can make through intensive management to increase yield per acre, which translates to increasing carbon per acre, which translates to increasing wood, to increasing opportunity to use forest land to maximize the opportunity to remove carbon from the air. This 13-fold increase, well, here's the most interesting thing. They cut the rotation by more than half. They got 13 times more wood in less than half the time. And I think here in the Pacific Northwest, we're probably about double. We're not 13 times, but we started with some pretty awesome stands. And we know that in half the time, and so this comes back to Ken's question, in about half the time that it used to take for a forest stand to get to a place of 50,000 board feet, let's just say if that's the target, it takes about half that amount of time now using management, and pretty aggressive management. So we're not the southeast, but then we didn't start with loblolly pine, we started with Douglas fir. So it's hard to improve on perfection. Here's a couple pictures of doing nothing and doing something. They both have their charm. But one is certainly going to address some of those issues with carbon storage a lot better than the other one, both in terms of species and in terms of income, which really leads to the most important thing that tree farmers can do. And that is keep forests as forests. And how are you going to do that? A lot of us come to tree farming a little bit later in life, and when you're done, your heirs are going to do whatever they're going to do. And so this is one of the biggest challenges we face here in Washington. In fact, more so in Washington than Oregon. But this sequesters carbon and this doesn't. And that's what we're seeing, 1.1% per year of development. So how do we address it? I love this example. There are other examples, but I don't have pictures of your place, so we're going to pick on Ken and Body. They're doing a really good job of developing a legacy for their family. And that legacy involves working on the tree farm, but it also involves this stuff, getting kids involved in things, getting them excited about doing this. It doesn't necessarily translate into, I want to be a tree farmer when I grow up. But it starts to move the needle. And I think with understanding this information about the value of management and the value of what you do as a contributor to solving this climate crisis, particularly if your heirs are concerned about that. I know more than one family whose child or grandchild has gone off and said, what are you doing? You're cutting down all the trees. How can you, you evil person? To be able to explain to them that actually what we're doing is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that includes cutting the trees. And so is there a framework? What is it that you need to understand to be able to pass that message on? And I can't help showing this picture. I was talking to some legislative aides at some tour I was on, and I looked over and they were looking at these little plastic tubes to protect the Stinson and deer, and they're kind of looking at them like, what is this? Like, what are these people crazy? And I said to them,
yes,
it's the diaper phase. I mean, these were young girls. It's the diaper phase. This is like diapering your kid. You kind of got to do it for a few years so they don't get eaten. And it totally clicked with them. So it's like we would not internally talk about these kinds of things in such rash ways, no pun intended, but the idea that whatever that simple statement is that helps the people that you interact with every day understand why you're tree farmers or why you want to be a tree farmer and what the benefits of doing that is going to be a very powerful way for us to really start to change the paradigm of the way that we think about forests and forest management and the importance of small forest landowners in this state, because we end up being that pretty critical part of the solution or part of the problem as we, surrender and develop, and the amount of area to grow trees gets less and less and less. So I just wanted to come back to this, because this system, really the basis of it is the sustainable forestry, but it drives everything else. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in these venues, and I think the work that we need to do in the sustainable forestry venue, more than anything, is to be able to articulate that story of why we are such a beneficial land use and why it's so important to sustain small forest landowners on the